The case you're about to see is a fictitious one, but the procedure is legally accurate. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public. Mr. Charles Lotterby, who appears for the Crown, has at the outset raised a point of law concerning the inadmissibility of certain evidence. Mr. Justice Mowbray has decided that the jury should leave the court while the matter is under discussion.
So what is your argument in the present case?
Well, my lord, it is, of course, the prosecution's case that the baby's death was deliberate. And I'm proposing to call evidence that the accused had already behaved violently towards this baby and another baby in the past. But I understand my learned friend objects to my introducing this evidence.
That is so, my lord.
Yes, Mr. Lotterby, it's obviously sensible for us to deal with it now. Yes, Miss Hawthorne?
My lord, I, of course, rely on the principle that it's not generally permissible for the prosecution to adduce evidence of an accused's previous bad conduct.
Yes, Miss Lotterby, you must bring yourself within one of the exceptions to the rule. I suppose you say it's similar fact evidence which rebuts the defence of accident.
Indeed, my lord, it is the prosecution's case that whenever this woman has a baby, she suffers severe postnatal depression and her babies suffer injuries as a result. In each case, she maintains that the injuries were accidental. But it is the prosecution's case that these events cannot be explained on the basis of coincidence, and moreover that the circumstances of each are so similar that the evidence has a particular cogency of its own.
Yes, it must be admissible, mustn't it, Miss Hawthorne, to rebut the defence of accident?
Very well, my lord.
Thank you, Miss Hawthorne. Thank you, Miss Lotterby. The jury may now be recalled.
I call Geoffrey Fisher. Geoffrey Fisher.
I told you should have got that baby off her. I told you she was hurting it.
It could have been an accident.
Poor little mite.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Will you give the court your full name, address, and occupation?
Geoffrey Ronald Fisher, 6 Overbury Court, Old Station Road, Fulchester. I'm a long-distance lorry driver, sir.
You are the husband of the accused, Robine.
Today's case in the Crown Court arose out of the death of Michael Fisher, 7-month-old son of Robine and Geoffrey Fisher. Michael was found dead in his cot by his father, and as a result of police inquiries, Robine Fisher has been charged with smothering him while in a state of postnatal depression. She maintains that Michael's death was an accident.
And what happened when you returned home?
Well, in the afternoon it was. I have to spend a lot of nights away from home, sir, with the lorry, you know. So I've been away a couple of days when this happened. And the first thing I find, the milk's not been taken in since I went. And there were letters all over the mat. And so I called the wife, but there wasn't any answer. So I went into the sitting room, and it's all dark, with the curtains drawn. And then I see her, the wife, in the armchair, just sitting there. Didn't look up, didn't say anything. I've never seen anything like it. She was like, you know, like a ghost or something.
Did you speak to her?
Yeah, I said, what's up? What's the matter? And I got this terrible feeling. I said, where's Michael? Something happened to Michael. And then she didn't say anything at all. Because he ought to have, you know, been playing in there. Afternoons was when she had him in there playing with his bricks and that.
What was Mrs. Fisher's reaction?
Well, nothing. She just kept on staring in front of us. So I rushed into Michael's room, and that's when I found him. His body in the cot.
Was Michael lying in his normal position?
Well, sir, he always slept on his back, and that was the way he was when I looked. But thing was, there were a load of blankets, 4 blankets and a pillow piled over his head. So I had to lift them off just to get at him. He was just in his vest, sir. No nappy or anything. His nappy was on the floor. I went to pick him up, sir. But when I touched him, he was cold and not the right colour. And I realised he wasn't breathing, and so I put my head to his chest. I knew he was dead.
Mr. Fisher, I appreciate that this is painful for you, but would you describe exactly how the pillow and the blankets were covering Michael?
Yeah. I'm sorry. The pillow was on top of his face. It was one of those baby pillows, you know, small. And then the blankets, they were just dumped over him, over the pillow and all, any old how.
Was Michael much of a wriggler? I mean, could he have accidentally wriggled under the pillow?
For goodness sake, he was only a little baby. I mean, he didn't move about that much. I'm not so that he could have got the thing over his head like that, you know, neat. And then he had bruises on his arms as if he'd been held down. And he never used to sleep with a pillow in his cot at all. It was the one from his pram, you know, to prop him up so he could see things when she took him around the shops. Well, it's dangerous, isn't it, using a pillow with a baby, in case that did happen, in case the baby got suffocated by it. So he never slept with a pillow.
Where was the pillow normally kept?
In the pram, in the hallway of the flat.
And the blankets, were they from the pram too?
No, they were his ordinary cot blankets. It was just the pillow that was from the pram.
Now, Mr. Fisher, what did you do after you discovered Michael's body?
I went back to the wife and asked her what happened.
What did you say to her?
I said, exactly what I said, you mean?
Indeed, yes, Mr. Fisher.
I said, you murdering bitch, you've done in the kid.
What was Mrs. Fisher's response?
She just said, I must have. And then she just went on staring and staring and staring. So I went and got the doctor and got the police.
Mr. Fisher, when you left home 2 days before to carry out your driving job, what was your wife's state of mind?
Very depressed, I'd say.
Was that unusual?
No, well, she would get these depressions in bouts after Michael was born.
What form did these depressions take?
I was sort of sitting around not being able to do the housework, saying she wished she never had the baby. I mean, I couldn't understand it, because he was a happy little chap, you know, really easy. She had some pills from the doctor, but they didn't seem to be doing no good.
Was she depressed before she had Michael?
No, not a bit of it. She was fine as long as she didn't have a baby to look after. Always going out, plenty of friends, just, well, cheerful. No, this thing, it was what you call postnatal depression, severe postnatal depression.
That's what the doctor said, is it, postnatal depression?
Yeah. Well, it is something women get, sir, some of them, when they've had a baby.
My lord, it is, of course, a medically recognized syndrome of depressive illness, caused, it is thought, by hormonal changes associated with pregnancy and parturition, and lasting anything between a few weeks and 18 months. At its most severe, it is not unknown for a normally gentle and placid woman to exhibit symptoms of violence which would...
My lord.
Yes, Miss Hawthorne?
Mr. Lotterby is not a qualified medical practitioner, my lord, and I'm not prepared to sit here and let him give evidence on matters quite outside his competence.
Miss Lotterby?
My lord, I will be calling expert evidence on this matter in due course.
Yes, I think Miss Hawthorne's objection is justified.
As your lordship pleases. Mr. Fisher, had Michael, before his death, been treated by a doctor for any injuries?
Yeah, twice. In May 77 and in July 77.
On the first occasion, what were these injuries?
He was bruised on the back of his head and had got concussion.
How did it happen?
Well, Michael had this crying spell, you see. Well, I said before he was a happy baby, but the night when it happened, he just went on crying for some reason. I asked Mrs. Fisher to be patient with him, but she was really working herself up into a temper.
Did the baby crying always affect Mrs. Fisher that way?
Yeah, it sort of starts something off in her, you know. She'd start swearing about the baby and things.
What did Mrs. Fisher do on this occasion?
Well, she went into his room and shouted at him to be quiet, and then came back into the front room where I was. But Michael just went on crying for some reason, louder by then. And she said, I'll wring his neck for him in a minute, and went back into his room. Well, there was this terrible crashing sound, and everything went quiet. when I went in to see what was up, Michael was lying at the wrong end of the cot, with his head against the bars. He'd been knocked unconscious.
And what was Mrs. Fisher's explanation for all this?
She said she picked him up and then tripped over something and dropped him. She said he must have fallen with his head against the side of the cot and banged his head.
Did she show you what she had tripped on?
No, she said she didn't know what it could have been.
Did you see anything that could have tripped?
No, well, there wasn't anything. No toys, no carpet or anything. It was just bare floorboard.
Did you hear any noise from the front room that could have been Mrs. Fisher tripping over? Stumbling footsteps? No.
The only sound I heard was her walking in and then stopping in the crash as Michael's head hit the side of the cot.
Now, what was the second occasion on which Michael was treated for injuries?
Well, the thing happened after I'd left for a driving job, and I didn't get back till late that night. Mrs. Cook, that's the lady from next door, she was around when it happened, but I wasn't. But she told me all about it.
Oh, Mrs. Cook will be giving evidence in due course, my lord. Mr. Fisher, around the time this incident happened, what was your wife's state of mind?
Well, same as the other time. She was very depressed.
Yes, I see. Now, Mr. Fisher, was Michael your wife's first child?
No, there's another boy, Darren, from previous marriage. Well, no, to be honest, sir, my wife was expecting him when we got married. April 75, that was, and Darren was born in July. Oh, I mean, he wasn't my kid, but I didn't mind. As far as I was concerned, he was my own son.
After Darren was born, did your wife suffer from postnatal depression?
Well, I didn't know that was what it was then, but she became a completely different girl from the one I married. I mean, she used to be really great, you know, ever since I'd known her. But after Darren was born, she just changed, got very down, very bad-tempered, didn't want to go out. So eventually I made her go to the doctor, and he said that that was what it was.
Did Darren suffer any injuries at all?
Yeah, in January 76, he was treated for a broken hand and badly bruised ribs.
How old was he at the time?
6 months old.
How did the injuries happen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, first of all, the wife said she'd left the side of the cot down and Darren had rolled out. But then when I went to check the cot to make sure it wouldn't happen again, I found that you couldn't get the side of the cot down that far, not so as it could roll out. So then she said she'd made a mistake. She hadn't meant the cot at all. She'd meant our bed. She'd had Darren on the bed and he'd rolled off.
How far from the floor was the top of this bed, Mr. Fisher?
About 1.5 feet, and the floor's carpeted.
Why? As a result of these injuries to Darren, what did you do?
I persuaded Mrs. Fisher to let Darren go and be looked after by her mother, Mrs. Corrigan.
What was Mrs. Fisher's reaction to this?
Well, in the end, she come round to my way of thinking, but she was terrible about it at first.
In what way terrible?
Well, things she said. She said if she'd known she was going to go through all that she'd gone through and then have her kid taken away, she'd rather have done away with him herself while she had the chance.
She'd rather have done away with him herself while she had the chance?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher, how many nights a week did your job take you away from home?
2, sometimes 3.
And of course, you were absent from home every day as well.
Yeah.
And I believe you worked at least 2 weekends a month to earn overtime.
That's right, yeah.
And while you were away, your wife was left in sole charge of Michael.
Yeah.
So, if Michael was a happy baby, as you've told us he was, it would be entirely due to the affectionate mothering of Mrs. Fisher, wouldn't it?
Well,
What, Mr. Fisher? Do you now wish to tell us that you've changed your mind and that Michael was not a happy baby?
No, look, what I meant was she didn't look after him that well. I mean, his clothes were never clean.
Mr. Fisher, we're not concerned with the discrepancy between your ideas of hygiene and those of your wife.
He was lucky if he got a bath once a week.
We are concerned with establishing whether or not your wife treated Michael with love and affection.
Yes, sir.
And if you were telling the truth when you told us that he was happy, then surely you must acknowledge that she did.
Listen, if she'd been any sort of mother, he wouldn't be dead, would he?
During her bouts of depression, did your wife ever behave violently towards Darren or Michael in front of you?
No. Well, she wouldn't, would she?
How, in fact, did she behave during her bouts of depression?
Well, like I said, sort of sitting around the house. No energy, just sitting, not bothering to get dressed or do the housework. I ended up doing it.
She was completely lethargic, in fact. She was also rather a clumsy person, wasn't she?
No, not more than most.
Oh, come on, Mr. Fisher. On several occasions during the past 2.5 years, your wife was treated by her doctor for a number of accidental injuries, was she not?
Oh, yeah, for a couple of piddly little cuts or burns or something.
Severe scalding after spilling a pan of water over her arm, a sewing machine needle through her finger, a sprained wrist after slipping over in a pair of high-heeled shoes. Now, Mr. Fisher, these are what you've rather callously described as a couple of piddling little cuts or burns. Don't they indicate to you someone who is clumsy or accident-prone?
Yeah, well, maybe it seems that way, but she wasn't.
Not in the normal way of things, you mean?
Right.
But, Mr. Fisher, we aren't talking about what your wife was like normally. We're talking about the effects on your wife's behaviour of postnatal depression. Depression which caused an otherwise careful and loving mother to become lethargic and clumsy.
It wasn't like that.
So clumsy, in fact, that not only her children, but she herself suffered from these unfortunate but accidental injuries.
You're twisting my words around. It's not like what you're trying to make me say.
How do you know it was like, Mr. Fisher, since you were never actually present when any of these injuries occurred?
Look, I saw the bruises. I saw those kids wearing filthy clothes, lying in filthy blankets with plasters on their arms or plasters on their ribs or bruises on their heads. And every time there was some pathetic story which never fitted. Yeah, and all right, I was never there when she had a go at them. Of course I wouldn't. She wouldn't touch them in front of me. I come home to find my little lad with a pillow on his head and covered in punch marks. And all that's come of it is some creep like you trying to make me say, yeah, OK, fine, there's just been a lot of accidents in my family.
So you say it was with the entirely altruistic motive of getting Darren better cared for and helping your wife recover from her depression that you had Darren removed into his grandmother's care. But that wasn't your motive at all, was it, Mr. Fisher?
How do you mean?
You told Mrs. Fisher that as a wife to you, she was a dead loss.
I might have done in a row.
And you gave Mrs. Fisher an ultimatum because of it, didn't you?
A what?
An ultimatum, Mr. Fisher, is what you gave your wife when you told her that unless she stopped moping over that other bastard's kid, then as far as you were concerned, the marriage was over. Do you deny that you said that?
Sorry, I don't remember.
Then I'll refresh your memory.
Thanks.
It was on the occasion of your sister's birthday party, which your wife, tired and depressed after the birth of Darren, quite understandably did not wish to attend. Oh, surely you remember now, Mr. Fisher?
Yeah, well, like I said, maybe it was in a row or something, yeah. But, you know, you say things in rows, things that you don't mean, like off the top of your head.
Or do you say things you do mean?
Eh?
Things you keep to yourself until you lose control.
Look, I told you before, as far as I was concerned, Darren was my own son.
A sentiment which does you credit, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you.
And one I'm sure that you tried very hard to maintain, until you discovered that far from being able to look upon Darren as your own son, you in fact resented the presence in your marriage of the other bastard's kid.
I didn't.
The truth is, isn't it, Mr. Fisher, that you used the excuse of your wife's depression to have Darren placed in someone else's care?
I didn't. Look, well, maybe I said what you told me I did, but I couldn't have meant it.
Indeed, Mr. Fisher.
No, it was just something you throw at someone. I mean, when you're angry.
In that case, why did you not have Michael sent away the first time he was hurt?
Because it was different that time.
Different, Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
On the contrary, as you have been at some pains to point out to us, the circumstances were exactly the same.
Well, look, it was different that time because it was her second kid. Oh, for God's sake, she'd already had one kid taken away from her. She couldn't have stood losing the other as well. I mean, she was bad enough with him, but if she'd have lost him as well, well, I thought she might go round the bend.
Isn't it the truth, Mr. Fisher, that you were not, in fact, as suspicious about Michael's accidents as you would like us to believe?
No. I mean, I was suspicious.
Well, if that's right, Mr. Fisher, if you were so concerned about your wife's behaviour, why did you not only allow her to have another baby, but leave her in charge of that new baby for such long periods?
I was there as much as I could be.
All that voluntary overtime at weekends,
We
Mr.
needed
Fisher?
the money.
But you could still have told the doctor about Michael.
I did!
Only after Michael's second accident. Only after your neighbour, Mrs. Cook, took it upon herself to report her suspicions to the doctor. Now, you were much closer to your wife than any mere neighbour, Mr. Fisher. You had much more opportunity to observe what really went on, and you didn't report anything to your doctor until influenced by Mrs. Cook, did you?
I wasn't influenced by her. It's my wife we're talking about. Men don't tell on their wives. Well, not if they want to make a go of their marriage. Look, can't you see I didn't want my marriage to break up? At first I thought if I tried to help and understand her, it would be all right. You know, she'd get over it. The bad things she was doing. Well, if I'd have thought she could have do what she did to Michael in the end, yeah, then it would have been different. I would have got something done about it before it was too late. But I didn't know. You can't know. Not your own wife. You can't believe she'd be as bad as that.
You can't believe she'd be as bad as that. Mr. Fisher, are you still living in the home you shared with your wife?
No. I moved out soon after Michael died.
How soon after?
3 weeks, just about.
Are you living on your own now?
No.
Aren't you, in fact, living with another woman?
Oh, my lord, I fail to see the relevance of this line of questioning.
Yes, Mr. Otterby, what point are you trying to establish, Miss Hawthorne?
My lord, I'm trying to show that the witness's attitude to his wife may well be coloured by another relationship.
I suppose it could be relevant, Mr. Lotterby.
Very well, my lord.
Mr. Fisher, aren't you, in fact, living with another woman?
Well, yeah. We're hoping to get married as soon as all... Well, I've already started divorce proceedings against Mrs. Fisher.
Divorce proceedings?
Well, divorce isn't a criminal offence, Miss Hawthorne.
No, my lord. But I think the jury should know when these proceedings started. When did you start them?
Oh, well, I moved out same time.
And when you moved out, it was straight to this other woman's house, was it not?
Yeah, but there was nothing between me and this other woman before, when I was still with Mrs. Fisher, I mean.
Really, Mr. Fisher? 3 weeks was enough, was it, for you to meet and become involved with another woman to the point where you set up home with her?
Well, I knew her from before.
How long before?
A couple of months before, but as a friend.
But it was around the time that you met your friend that you approached the doctor about your wife's unsatisfactory behaviour.
Yeah? Well, it's got nothing to do with it, if that's what you mean.
On the contrary, Mr. Fisher, doesn't it have everything to do with it?
No.
I suggest to you that you at last reported your wife's behaviour to your doctor to demonstrate her unfitness as a mother, because at this time you were hoping to divorce her and set up home with this other woman,
true.
Taking Michael with you.
Listen, you're trying to make me out to be some sort of... Look, all the things I've told you about Mrs. Fisher... Yeah, well, all right, if Michael was alive, yeah, I'd have something to gain. But all the things I've told the police and everything I've told you... Michael's dead now. And nothing nobody says is going to bring him back.
Join us again tomorrow when the case of the Queen against Fisher will be resumed in the Crown Court.
I called Dr. McGillivray.
John McGillivray is the pathologist of St Andrew's Hospital, Fulchester. Following a post-mortem examination carried out by him on 9-month-old Michael Fisher, the police instituted proceedings against Robine Fisher, his mother, for smothering Michael while in a state of severe postnatal depression. She has pleaded not guilty.
You were the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on 9-month-old Michael Fisher.
I was.
What did you find as the primary cause of death?
Failure, whether accidental or induced, of the breathing mechanism.
Can you say whether either of the two possible causes is the more probable?
It could have been accidental, though I consider it unlikely.
What evidence was there to indicate that Michael's death was not accidental?
A good deal. I have here photographs of all the bruising, plus the blankets and the pillow and the photographs over there, and the vest he was wearing at the time of death.
Are those the photographs, the vest, the pillow, and the blankets?
They are.
Thank you. And now these are exhibits 1 to 5. Perhaps they may be shown to the jury. Perhaps you could take us through the pictures one at a time, Doctor, if you would.
Of course. Exhibit 1. This photograph shows the corpse of the infant. The infant is spread-eagled, dressed only in a soiled vest. We cut the vest from the corpse, and then photograph exhibit 2 is taken. You'll notice the bruising in the region of the shoulders, fresh bruising, suggesting finger marks and consistent with the baby having been forcibly gripped and held down. You'll also see slight bruising in the face and slight bruising by the nostril, suggesting that pressure had also been applied there.
Was this bruising in the nasal region consistent with the baby having had a pillow pressed over his face?
Quite consistent, yes. It would not be as marked as in the region of the shoulders because of the diffusing effect of the pillow. But it could have been caused by the pressure of the hand pressing upon the pillow.
Is there any other way in which these bruises could have occurred on some other occasion? I mean, a fall, for instance, or having been dropped?
I do not think there is any angle at which he could have fallen from which he could have obtained bruising in such a pattern. This would be borne out by the absence of bruising in other areas, such as the cranial region or the lower limbs, which I would have expected to be present if a falling accident had occurred.
In your opinion, Doctor, had Michael been well cared for prior to his death?
I do not pretend to be able to assert whether or not he had received sufficient mothering in the emotional sense. But at the time of his death, he was considerably underweight for a baby of his age and size. He was inadequately clad, merely a vest, for sleeping in at that time of year. And he was very dirty.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Dr. McGillivray, could the bruises found on Michael have been made after the moment of death?
I don't quite see what you're getting at. How soon after?
Well, what I'm getting at, Dr. McGillivray, is could they have been made at any time after Michael's death?
In order to present the appearance they did in fact present, they would have had to have been made very soon after, within minutes, perhaps even seconds.
Could they have been made by the frantic attempts of a distraught mother to, let us say, shake some life into the body of a much-loved baby that she had just found dead?
Yes. It's theoretically possible, yes.
Could the slight bruising beside the baby's nose be due to his mother's frightened attempts to resuscitate him by means of the kiss of life method, which necessitates pinching the nose in order to be effective?
Again, I would say theoretically, yes. Provided always, of course, that Mrs. Fisher was actually aware of this method of resuscitation.
It's been given wide publicity in many of the women's magazines, Dr. McGillivray. Now, no doubt in the course of your work as a pathologist, you've had to investigate a number of sudden infant deaths.
Unfortunately, yes.
Doubtless, then, you're familiar with the syndrome known as cot death.
Of course.
Doctor, I expect we all understand what we mean by cot death, but could you give us a medical definition of the term?
It is generally defined, my lord, as the unexpected death of an apparently normal and healthy infant under 2 years of age.
Thank you.
I'm instructed, my lord, that it usually occurs when the infant is put to bed and when looked at a few hours later or the next morning is found to be dead.
Is that so, Doctor?
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. McGillivray, is it ever possible to tell for certain, on the basis only of a post-mortem examination, whether an infant found dead in mysterious circumstances, as Michael was, has been smothered, or whether he is, in fact, the victim of this unfortunate cot death syndrome?
It depends on the strength of the evidence either way. If the infant is clean and well fed, looks well cared for, then naturally we prefer to give the mother the benefit of the doubt and return a verdict of cot death.
You've not quite answered my question, Dr. McGillivray. I repeat, is it ever possible to tell for certain?
No, it is not possible to tell for certain. A post-mortem itself cannot reveal all the circumstances of a death.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. McGillivray. You've been most helpful.
Mrs. Cook, how long have you lived next door to the accused, Mrs. Fisher?
Well, I was there when they moved in. It would be about May 1975.
Did you do a lot of babysitting for Mrs. Fisher?
Well, if she wanted to go out, she'd leave me with the front door key, and then if I heard Michael cry or anything, I was to go in and see if he was all right. The walls of the flats are quite thin, you see.
How often did you have to go in?
Well, I mean, to tell you the truth, I used to go in anyway, even if he didn't cry, just to see he was comfortable. I don't hold with leaving kids on their own at the best of times, do you?
Indeed not. Mrs. Cook, you had ample opportunity to study Michael's progress from week to week. Was he well cared for?
Was he what? Poor little mite. If he had a change of clothes once in a week, I'd like to have seen it. He had a dirty vest, runny nose, food all down his jumper. Stank, he did. Blimey, he didn't even have a clean nappy most of the time. I mean, I'd find him with a soaking wet tea towel on him, or, well, sometimes just nothing at all.
Did you ever notice anything else about him?
Yes, I saw bruises on him 3 times.
Would you describe those times, please?
Well, the first I saw was May last year. He was about 4 months old. There was some on his ribs. And I said to her at the time, you know, just sort of curious-like, how did he get them? And her face, well, red wasn't the word. I mean, beetroot, she went, and mumbled something about him slipping out of her hands when she was giving him his bath.
Did you say anything more to her about it?
Well, no, you know, not at the time. I mean, I might not have thought any more of it, except I found some new marks a couple of weeks later. They were on the inside of his arms, you know, as though she'd gone like this with him hard. Listen, I felt a bit sorry for her, to tell you the truth. I mean, theirs is a poky little flat, and her husband was out all the time. I mean, I don't want anyone thinking I was just sort of going in there and poking my nose in for the hell of it. I just thought I might be able to help the way things were with her.
No one suggests, Mrs. Cook, that you were motivated by anything other than compassion. Did you comment on this new outbreak of bruises to Mrs. Fisher?
Well, I'd read a bit about how some of these women knock the kids around, you know, battered babies when things are going bad with them. And so I just said, now, look, love, you needn't be afraid to tell me because I'll help, but have you been hurting the little lad, you know, on purpose? Interfering old cow, she called me, and bawled me out and told me not to come back. Anyway, she come round later and apologised, and she said how everything was getting her down. She couldn't cope with the baby. And she said how that morning his crying had been driving her mad.
What did you do?
Well, I thought, let's try a bit of psychology. So I said, you know, when my kids was little, I mean, I used to get that upset with her crying sometimes that I'd just pick 'em up and shake 'em. I just thought it might make her open up if she felt she wasn't alone. Well, she looked at me and she started crying again, and she said, oh, it's worse than that. I'm worse than you. And just then we had somebody moving around next door. Mr. Fisher had come back and she rushed out. So what else she was going to tell me, I'll never know.
She said, oh, it's worse than that. I'm worse than you.
Yes.
What was the next time you noticed something about Michael's condition?
Well, I didn't see anything of her for about a month after that. She was avoiding me, you know. And then she suddenly comes banging on my door one day. She said, the pram's fallen over, with him in it, as she was trying to get it out the door. And he seems to be breathing funny, and he's gone all dopey.
You say the walls of the flats are very thin. Could you hear the noise of the pram falling over?
I never heard a thing. And I'll tell you what else. I mean, the hallway and the door, they're that narrow. A drunk couldn't fall over in there, let alone a damn great pram.
Did you get a close look at Michael?
Oh, yes. Mrs. Fisher tried very hard not to let me, but I wasn't having any of it. And I swear it, he got a bruise the size of an egg on the back of his head. He got some punch mark things on his ribs. He got some more marks on his little backside.
What did you do as a result?
Well, I got the doctor in for him. And I told him, the doctor, about all the other things I'd seen. She never spoke to me after that.
Mrs. Cook, coming to the day before Michael's death, was he crying a lot?
Yes. Sort of feverish crying. Oh, it just seemed to go on. I would have done something, you know. I mean, phoned the doctor or something. But I thought, well, I've got nothing in the past from interfering, so I left it.
When did the crying cease?
Well, the last time I heard it was when I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm a light sleeper.
Did you hear anything else?
Yes, I heard her shouting and banging, as if the cot was being banged against the wall again and again. And then the crying just stopped.
Did it stop suddenly?
No, it just got weaker and weaker, and then it stopped.
Did you hear anything else for the rest of the night or the
No.
following day?
No, nothing. And I wish I hadn't kept my nose out now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cook.
Mrs. Cook, when Mrs. Fisher explained to you that Michael had slipped out of her hands while she was bathing him, was there anything in the appearance or the position of the bruises to suggest otherwise?
Well, no, it was just she went such a bright red.
Or don't you think, Mrs. Cook, that any young and inexperienced mother, on being pulled up for carelessness by an older and obviously very competent mother, might not go bright red out of sheer embarrassment?
Well, you make it sound all right, I must say, but what about all the other times?
Yes, Mrs. Cook, we're coming to those times. Now, on the second occasion you found bruises on Michael, you made an attempt to find out if Mrs. Fisher had been deliberately injuring Michael, did you not?
Yes.
Would you repeat the exact words you used?
Well, I said something like, when my kids was little, I used to get that upset with her crying. Sometimes I'd just pick 'em up and shake 'em.
And what did Mrs. Fisher reply?
She said, it's worse than that. I'm worse than you.
Exactly, Mrs. Cook. Not, I have done worse than that, but it's worse than that, meaning it upsets me more than that. And I'm worse than you, meaning I am not fortunate enough to be able to handle a baby as confidently as you. Now, would you agree that Michael did not normally cry a lot?
No, not very much.
A contented baby, in fact.
Well, it beats me why, but yes.
It beats you why, Mrs. Cook? Could it not be that despite all his mother's depression, clumsiness and inexperience, Michael was a contented baby because he was loved and cherished?
Listen, I'll tell you something, dear. You can love a kid more than anybody's been loved in the history of the world, and still want to knock its brains out sometimes. And what's more, you'll do it if you're a certain kind of person.
Very picturesque way of putting it, Mrs. Cook. But it hasn't been demonstrated that Mrs. Fisher was that kind of person. Now, I believe you said that the walls dividing your flat and the Fishers are very thin.
They're not very satisfactory.
And what's more, you're a light sleeper.
Yes, fairly light.
And during the night that Michael died, you awoke once to hear him crying and heard Mrs. Fisher moving around.
Yes.
And there were no screams.
And I heard the shouting and the banging.
But there was nothing in the baby's cries to disturb or alarm you, like screams as he was forcibly and painfully held down.
Nothing like that, no.
And rather than stopping abruptly, as it would have done if anything sinister had occurred, the crying trailed off gradually.
Yes, I said it got weaker and weaker.
And that was absolutely the last noise you heard, the sound of Michael's crying gradually trailing off.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cook.
Dr. Farrell.
Thank you.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
What is your full name, address, and occupation?
Andrew George Baines Farrell, Borthwick House, Roxton, Fulchester. I'm in general practice.
How long has Robine Fisher been your registered patient?
Since she first came to this district in May 1975.
When did you start treating her for postnatal depression?
My lord, I do have my patient's notes with me. May I refer to them?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. That would be in November 1975, 4 months after the birth of her first child, Darren. The treatment continued for 7 months, during which Darren was transferred into his grandmother's care.
Before Darren was taken into his grandmother's care, did you treat him for injuries sustained whilst in Mrs. Fisher's charge at home?
Yes, he was brought to me in some distress by Mrs. Fisher, suffering from a broken hand and badly bruised ribs.
Did she say how he had sustained those injuries?
Yes, she told me that Darren had rolled off her bed, and not being aware of it, she stepped back on his hand and lost her balance and fell awkwardly with her knee across his chest.
Did you accept Mrs. Fisher's explanation, or did you question her further about it?
I was prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt.
The benefit of the doubt, yes. When was Mrs. Fisher's next bout of depression?
I started treating her in March 1977, a month after the birth of Michael.
Were you also required to treat Michael for injuries?
Yes, I was called in on 2 occasions. The first by Mrs. Fisher, after Michael had sustained a blow to his head when Mrs. Fisher fell with him. And the second time by Mrs. Grace Cook, also involving a blow to the head, plus some superficial bruising to his ribs and the base of his spine.
As a result of these 2 incidents, what did you do?
I contacted the local branch of the social services, and they put Mrs. Fisher in twice-weekly contact with a social worker, Miss Aileen Brace.
As a rule,
I would just like to say at this point that I did not necessarily think that Mrs. Fisher had deliberately injured Michael. I certainly did think that both mother and child would benefit from informed and caring supervision. But I must repeat that I was certainly not convinced that both Michael's and Darren's injuries were deliberately inflicted. I'm quite sure that a lot of battering cases go undetected. For every one I see, there are probably 5 I do not see. But I'm equally sure that a baby like Michael Fisher, with a mother as unhappy and inept as Robine Fisher, need not necessarily have been the victim of anything but gross clumsiness. You must take each case as you find it and be guided by what you know of the mother.
Yes, Doctor, am I right in saying that you felt that Mrs. Fisher was not a battering mother?
Exactly. But again, in all fairness, that is all it was, a feeling.
Thank you.
You are indeed trying your hardest to be fair, Dr. Farrell. Did you see Mrs. Fisher on the day that Michael's death was discovered?
Yes, I was called in by Geoffrey Fisher at 5 o'clock on that afternoon. I discovered Mrs. Fisher to be in a state of extreme shock, and I arranged for her to spend the night under sedation at St. Andrew's Hospital.
A state of extreme shock resulting from the fact that she had just killed her own child?
Or by finding Michael already dead in his cot.
Yes, Doctor, I was about to say that. But it is quite possible that the state she was in was a result of her having killed her child. And it is possible, is it not?
Her state was certainly consistent with both of the alternative causes of Michael's death. Again, I would like, if you will allow me, to point out that there is no necessary connection between Michael's injuries and Michael's death, in my opinion. That is to say, even if Mrs. Fisher were the kind of woman who battered her child, she need not necessarily be the kind of woman who would kill her child.
But that, of course, is only your opinion. Speaking in a general way, Dr. Farrell, is it possible for postnatal depression to manifest itself in hostility and violence towards a baby?
In a general way, yes, although, of course, it doesn't happen all the time. It would depend on the personality of the mother. If she has an aggressive streak that is normally repressed, it would be quite possible for her depression to loosen the grip she has on her aggression. It might only take the stimulus of a child crying for a long period of time for no apparent reason. Very powerful and emotive stimulus. And such a woman might express her frustration and misery by lashing out at the child.
And we have already heard that postnatal depression made Robine Fisher bad-tempered and that Michael's crying drove her mad. Thank you, Dr. Farrell.
Dr. Farrell, in your role as family physician, You've been able to observe Robine Fisher with a detached professional eye.
I would like to think so.
And you've been at some pains to point out to the court, as a detached and professional observer, that you do not think Mrs. Fisher could have smothered her baby.
No, I said I did not think it at all certain that Mrs. Fisher had deliberately injured Michael, and that and the act of smothering were in any case not necessarily connected. She could have done one without the other, that's a point.
But you do not think that Robine Fisher has this aggressive streak you mentioned?
No, in my opinion, she has rather a passive personality, who, when frustrated or depressed, would be rather more inclined to revert to tears and inertia.
Can we move on to the subject of cot death? In your experience, do respiratory infections, however mild, accompany many such deaths?
In my experience, yes, although, of course, I'm not an expert.
And you had treated Michael Fisher for a cold shortly before his death, had you not?
Yes, Mrs. Fisher telephoned me 3 days before his death for advice, as a result of which I made a house visit. Michael did have a cold, but not a serious one.
Mrs. Fisher, you say, was in a state of shock when you were called to her following Michael's death.
She was.
Now, could that shock have set in as soon as she went to Michael's cot and found his body?
Yes, of course.
Would it be consistent with a state of extreme shock that she should attempt some bizarre and frenzied course of action, such as pummeling the child to wake it and piling blankets and pillows over it to warm it up?
Yes, quite consistent.
As would her subsequent near comatose state?
Yes.
And would she have a lack of grasp on subsequent events?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
Well, would she perhaps not react to events in the normal way?
Oh, yes, that's quite possible.
You see, we've heard evidence that her husband accused her of murdering her child. Mr. Fisher said to her, "You murdering bitch, you've done in the kid." And it's alleged she said, "I must have."
I would not be particularly impressed by anything she said whilst in that state. She might even be seized with quite irrational guilt at finding him dead and actually believe she did kill him, even if she did not.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Farrell.
Join us again tomorrow when the case of the Queen against Fisher will be concluded in the Crown Court.
Defendant Robine Fisher.
Robine Fisher, the accused, is charged with smothering her 9-month-old son, Michael, while in a state of severe postnatal depression. She has pleaded not guilty.
Take the book in your right hand. Read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mrs. Fisher, I know this is very painful for you, but would you tell us of the sequence of events leading up to Michael's death?
When?
Mrs. Fisher, you're going to have to speak much louder than that, so that we can all hear you.
Yes. Sorry.
All right.
Where shall I start?
Well, begin from the Thursday morning your husband left for his 2-day driving job. Now, Michael was ill, wasn't he?
Yes. Yes. He had a cold. The sniffles. I'd had to get the doctor to him, and he still wasn't right. He was very, grisly. So in the afternoon I had him in the front room for a bit, but he didn't seem to want to play. So then I put him down, in his cot. I thought he might doze off for a bit, but he went on grizzling. And I brought him back into the front room and propped him up so he could watch me.
What did you prop him on?
I wrapped him in his cot blankets and I laid him on the seat of the armchair.
Was that all you did?
Oh, no. I'm sorry, it's hard to remember everything I did in the right order. I got the little pillow from the pram and, put it behind his head and neck, because the armchair seat, it slopes back a bit,
Inside the blankets? Did you put the pillow inside the blankets?
Yes, I tucked it in.
Did Michael stay awake for long?
Oh, yes. Ages and ages. He didn't want his tea or anything. I had to keep going to him. And every time I went away, you know how it is, he'd start crying. So then I thought, well, he's tired out. Perhaps if I go into the kitchen and wait, he might cry himself out and drop off to sleep. So that's what I did.
What time did he drop off eventually?
Oh, about 7 o'clock, I suppose. He went quiet, and I waited for about 10 minutes until he was completely asleep, and then I went back into him. He was fast asleep. So I picked him up and I put him in his cot. I'm sorry, I was just thinking of him asleep.
Do you feel able to go on now, Mrs. Fisher?
Yes, I'm all right now.
When you picked Michael up, did you take him out of the blankets?
No, I picked up the whole lot, I think. Yes, I did.
Why was that?
Well, I thought it might disturb him if I got him out the blankets, so I just bundled him into bed like he'd been in the armchair.
So the pillow was still under his head when you put him down in the cot?
It was sort of tucked inside the blankets, yes. I just didn't think very much about it being there, you know. I just wanted to disturb him as little as I possibly could.
Can you go on now, Mrs. Fisher? Did Michael wake in the night at all?
Once, I know.
I still find it very difficult to hear a lot of what you're saying, Mrs. Fisher. Please try and speak up so the jury and the whole of the court can hear.
Once. He woke up once that I know of. Sometime just before daybreak. I'd taken this pill. This sleeping pill, so I wasn't sure what time it was. 4, 5, something. I heard him crying.
And you went to him?
I suppose so. Can't you see, I can't remember very well this pill I'd taken. You know how you dream things? You think you've done something and you haven't really, or you have done something and you think it's while you're dreaming, but it isn't.
What do you think you did?
I don't know. I must have taken his nappy and his nightie off. I think I took them off because he was wet. Yeah, that's right, and there wasn't another nappy, so I left him in his vest.
Did you move the pillow and the blankets?
Yeah, I must have done. Moved it to one side or something. Yes, I would have had to take off his nappy. It was all dark. And I can remember standing over the cot, sort of half swaying, half asleep. I wanted him to shut up because I wanted to go on sleeping, and he kept on crying. So I put my hands on the bars of the cot and I shoved it against the wall and shouted for him to shut up, but I didn't do it. I didn't care. Never, I wouldn't. He was my baby.
Could you bring a glass of water? Would you like to sit down, Mrs. Fisher? Do you feel you can go on now, Mrs. Fisher?
Was Michael still crying when you went back to bed?
Yes. He went on for a bit, and then he drifted off to sleep, and so did I.
What time did you wake in the morning?
About 6 o'clock it was. I woke up because it was all so quiet. You know how you can be woken by silence. Michael, he should have been crying for his feed. Or sometimes he'd lie in his cot and make cooing noises. But there was nothing.
What did you do?
I went into him. I tried to wake him, but I couldn't.
What did you do in order to get him awake?
Well, first I sort of pushed at him, and then I pinched him. I thought it would hurt him and make him cry. I thought he must be sleeping deeply because he'd been ill the day before. I don't know what I did then, if I picked him up or not. I knew that half of me suddenly knew what was the matter, and there was another half of me that kept on doing other things. I shook him and shook him. I couldn't believe it was happening. I thought if I could blow some air into his lungs, I could make him come back, because he was still warm. So I started blowing air into his lungs. I went on for ages and ages, but it didn't make any difference. I thought if he was still warm, he couldn't have been dead. I remember thinking, as long as I keep him warm, it'll be all right.
How did you try to keep him warm?
Well, I picked him up with the blankets round him, and I tried to rub him with the blankets. It sounds stupid, but that's what I did.
And then what did you do?
Well, then I put him back in his cot. And I remember thinking I had to phone the doctor. And then I got this phrase running through my mind. You know the thing the doctor always says to you when you phone him up? He says, keep him warm and well wrapped up. So I thought that's what I had to do. So I put some blankets on him. You know how you think these things when you're in a dream?
What did you do with the pillow?
I used that to cover him too. I thought it would be warm like the blankets.
And then what happened?
And then I went into the front room and waited for the doctor to come.
Just a moment. You phoned for the doctor?
No, I couldn't have. But I thought I had. So I went in the front room and waited.
How long did you wait?
I don't know. All day, I suppose, and all night, and part of the next day, too. That's what people have said. But I didn't know at the time.
Do you remember your husband coming home?
Not very well. He was just suddenly there.
Do you remember him saying, You murdering bitch, you've done in the kid, haven't you?
He said something, but I couldn't really make out what he was saying.
You couldn't understand, you mean?
Well, I knew he was telling me something about Michael, but I didn't really know what was happening.
And when you replied, I must have, you didn't know what was happening either?
Well, I couldn't work out why he was suddenly there like that. I knew something awful had happened, but I couldn't remember what it was. And when he said that about me murdering Michael, I thought that was the thing, the awful thing that had happened.
But as you recovered from the shock of Michael's death over the following weeks, did you begin to remember what had really happened? Mrs. Fisher, did you begin to remember what really had happened?
Yes, I remember most of it now.
Mrs. Fisher, when you had Darren and then Michael with you, did you try to look after them to the best of your ability?
Oh, yes.
Did you on any occasion deliberately injure either of them?
No, I wouldn't have done that.
Had Dr. Farrell prescribed any drugs for your depressive illness?
Yes, I was on tranquilizers.
And what effect did these drugs have on you?
Well, I don't know whether it was the drugs or the depression itself, but I felt very slow and I kept knocking things over, spilling pans, that kind of thing.
Were you feeling like that when the accidents happened to Darren and Michael?
Yes, I was.
Now let's go back to the day Darren had his accident. Will you tell us how it happened?
He fell off the bed, our bed, and I didn't see him and sort of stepped back on him and fell. I know I told my husband something else at first, but I was frightened. You see, he always used to go on at me about putting Darren on our bed. He said Darren made the bed cover dirty, you know, what with his nappy and bringing up his feet a bit and everything. So when the accident happened, I pretended he'd fallen out of his cot. I know it was a lie.
Did your husband find it easy to get used to Darren?
Well, he did try, but you see, I'd known Mr. Fisher, for a long time before we were married. He was just a friend, but we were very fond of each other. And then I got pregnant with Darren by another boy. Well, the other boy didn't want to know, so Jeff asked me to marry him and said he'd bring the baby up as his own. Well, he did try, but me being so depressed and everything, we just started having trouble about it. Terrible rows.
So was there any connection between Darren's accident and the fact that he went to your mother?
Well, Jeff did use that when he tried to persuade me, but it wasn't the main thing.
Is it true that you said, if I'd known I was going to have him taken away from me, I'd have got rid of him while I had the chance?
Yeah, but not in the way he meant.
What was the way you meant it?
Having an abortion. I would have done that.
Now, Mrs. Fisher, bringing the story up to date. You see quite a lot of Darren at the moment, don't you?
Yes. I've moved back in with my mum.
And with your mother's help, you're looking after him?
Yes. I'd like to have him back with me. You know, when this is over.
Have you been having medical treatment since Michael's death?
Yes, well, I had to stay in the hospital for 2 weeks after it happened because, you know, I wasn't right in my mind. And then when I moved back in with my mum, I started having psychiatric treatment as an outpatient for my, you know, the depression.
And you're getting better?
Well, I still feel down a lot of the time, but yes, I'm getting better. And with Darren there and everything, it helps me being with him.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fisher.
Mrs. Fisher, you can now remember the events surrounding Michael's death, can you?
Most of them, yes.
Then I wonder why it is that your memory is so conveniently hazy about what happened when you awoke in the night to hear Michael crying.
Well, I was sleepy. I can remember being sleepy.
Ah, yes, you said, I have your words here, you know how you dream things. You think you've done something and you haven't really, or you have done something and you think it's while you're dreaming, but it isn't. You have done something and you think it's while you're dreaming, but it isn't.
Do you think you can get me to say that I did it? How did I? In my sleep, did I? I told the truth. I said what happened as best I can remember it, but you're trying to make out it was all lies.
Well, isn't it?
No, I'm not a liar. I know I'm bad. You all think I'm bad. But I'm not a liar.
Mrs. Fisher, you have already admitted to this court that you tell lies. Don't you remember telling us about your other baby, Darren's accident? Don't you remember telling us how you lied on that occasion to your husband? I put it to you, Mrs. Fisher, if you are capable of lying to your husband simply to save your face, are you not now lying to this court when so much more depends on it?
Miss Brace, when did your contact with Mrs. Fisher start?
I was assigned to her case after Dr. Farrell had contacted our department, so it was 2 days after Michael's accident with the pram.
How much did you see of her thereafter?
Well, I arranged to visit her regularly, twice a week. Well, of course, she was welcome to get in touch with me at any time, and she often did.
When you first met her, what was Robine Fisher like as a mother?
Well, I had no doubts at all about her affection for Michael. Well, some women, when they're depressed, they go cold on their babies. Well, that didn't happen with her.
In what way did depression affect her?
Well, the flat and the baby were pretty filthy.
But how significant was that?
Oh, my goodness, Michael wasn't any worse cared for than any number of babies I've had on my case book. Well, he certainly could have done with a better standard of treatment than the one he was getting.
But that was to be expected in that kind of case.
Oh, yes. I mean, Mrs. Fisher, she was trying to cope under tremendous difficulties. She was terribly depressed. She was living in a pretty nasty council block flat. She hardly saw her husband from one day to the next, and her mother lived some 20 miles away. She had no friends. She had no one she could turn to for advice. Oh, unless you count Mrs. Cook, whose attitude seems to have been pretty aggressive and invariably critical. Well, she didn't even have anyone she could go and moan to if things got bad.
Did you notice any improvement in Mrs. Fisher after your visits began?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, nothing startling. Well, that takes months, not days or weeks. No, she really was beginning to take a more positive approach.
In what way?
Well, she'd begun to contact me on her own initiative if she was worried about Michael or needed advice. She wanted to know what sort of foods would be good for the baby. It seemed he'd been living on bread and jam, mainly. And she also wanted advice about his crying. I told her that he might enjoy sitting propped up in the afternoon with a pillow, so he could watch her instead of lying bored in his cot.
How about her depression? Did that seem to improve?
Yes. As I said, she was certainly becoming more positive. Well, a severely depressed woman wouldn't have summoned up the energy to contact me voluntarily. Well, as I said, it wasn't a startling improvement, but it was definitely there.
Now, you saw Mrs. Fisher 3 days before Michael's death, did you not?
Yes.
What sort of frame of mind was she in then?
Better than I'd ever seen her. She said that now she had sorted out why Michael sometimes cried, or he was bored, that sort of thing. She felt much more able to cope. She didn't feel so frustrated anymore.
Thank you very much, Miss Brace.
Miss Brace, how long before Michael's death was it that you'd known Mrs. Fisher?
6 weeks.
6 weeks, and you normally saw her what, twice a week?
Yes.
So you wouldn't deny that her character and her moods were far less familiar to you than, say, her husband?
Well, that depends on how far back you want to go. I would say that in the last 6 weeks of Michael's life, I was far better qualified to assess Mrs. Fisher's moods, because her husband was hardly ever there.
Miss Brace, you give every appearance of someone who is very involved with her job. Am I right?
Oh, yes, of course I am. Social workers have to be.
Someone I'd imagine who gets very involved with the people in her care.
Well, that depends, too, on what you mean by involved. If you mean I do my best for them, and I help them try and make a go of their lives, well, yes, I do. I do get involved. If you mean I get so caught up in their own problems that I cease to be impartial, no, I don't. Ask any social worker and they'll tell you if you get that involved, you'd go daft.
Thank you, Miss Brace.
The offence of infanticide, members of the jury, was introduced because it became well known that some women do suffer severe mental disturbance after the birth of a child. And it was considered inappropriate to charge a woman with murder who had killed her child while the balance of her mind was so disturbed. Now, it is accepted by the prosecution that the accused is a woman who did experience this well-recognized state, which the doctors call postnatal depression. So there is no charge of murder. It is a charge of infanticide. And a conviction for infanticide is simply a conviction of manslaughter. No more. So, the whole question in this case is whether the child did die of natural causes, whether this was a cot death, or whether the accused deliberately smothered the child. The burden of proof in this case is the same as in any other case. The accused is innocent until proved guilty. And unless on the evidence you feel satisfied that the accused did kill the child, your verdict must be one of not guilty. Now, will you please retire, elect a foreman to speak for you, and consider your verdict.
All stand. Foreman, please stand. Answer the question yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the accused guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Very well, Mrs. Fisher, you are free to go. You obviously need all the help that you can get. Miss Brace, you're still visiting Mrs. Fisher, are you?
Yes, my lord.
Good. I must say it seems to me a great pity that she didn't get help at an earlier stage.
All stand.